The most dangerous weapon in occupied France wasn't a submachine gun hidden under a floorboard. It wasn't a radio transmitter chirping in an attic. It was a small, amber-colored bottle of lactic acid. In the hands of an 18-year-old boy with stained fingers and tired eyes, that liquid was more powerful than a battalion of tanks. His name was Adolfo Kaminsky. To the world, he was a nobody. A skinny apprentice in a dry cleaner shop in Veer, but to the thousands of children marked for death by the Gestapo, he was the ghost who gave them a future by erasing their past. Adolfo's journey didn't begin with a hero's call. It began with the smell of steam and the harsh sting of chemicals. He was a boy who fell in love with the logic of stains. He spent his days learning how to lift ink from silk, how to dissolve grease without scarring the fabric, how to manipulate the very molecules of a garment. He was an artist of the invisible. But in 1943, the world was no longer interested in clean laundry. The world was interested in blood. When his family was arrested and sent to the Drancy internment camp, Adolfo saw the machinery of the Holocaust up close. They were saved only by a quirk of fate, an Argentine passport. But that moment of terror changed him. He realized that a single piece of paper, a single stamp of ink, was the difference between a life and a pile of ash. When he joined the Jewish resistance in Paris, they didn't hand him a grenade. They handed him a fountain pen. The underground needed a forger, someone who could turn a Levy into a Leroy, someone who could strip the dreaded red J for Juif from an identity card without leaving a trace. Adolfo descended into a basement laboratory, a world of shadows lit only by the flickering glow of a desk lamp. Here he became an alchemist. He experimented with chemicals, learning that lactic acid could dissolve the indelible purple ink used by the Vichy government. He learned how to age paper using tea and dust, how to mimic the subtle tremors of a bureaucrat's signature, how to carve rubber stamps with the precision of a diamond cutter. The pressure was suffocating. Every hour the Gestapo was tightening the noose. The resistance would bring him lists of names, hundreds of children who needed to be spirited away to the countryside or across the border. Adolfo worked in a fever dream of acetic acid and ink. He stopped sleeping. He would lean over his workbench, his eyes stinging from the fumes, forcing his hands to remain steady as he scraped away a person's identity to write a new, safer one. He calculated the cost of his fatigue in human souls. In 1 hour, he would tell himself, I can make 30 fake documents. If I sleep for 1 hour, 30 people will die. This was his war, a race against the sunrise, fought with a magnifying glass and a steady heart. In the heart of occupied Paris, at 17 Rue Despair, there was a sign that read Chemical Research Laboratory. To any passerby or inquisitive German patrol, it was legitimate. But behind the heavy curtains, Adolfo Kaminsky was performing a different kind of science. He had gathered a small team, but he remained the master. His hands were always stained, sometimes yellow from nitric acid, sometimes deep purple from the inks he brewed himself. He didn't just copy documents, he reinvented them. He studied the grain of the paper used in different regions of France, the exact chemical composition of the watermarks, and the precise pressure of the stamps used by various prefectures. He was a perfectionist. The logistical challenge was staggering. One morning, a courier arrived with a desperate plea. 300 Jewish children in an orphanage were about to be deported. Their only hope was a complete set of papers, birth certificates, baptismal records, and ration cards, all to be delivered by dawn. Adolfo looked at the clock. He had less than 12 hours. In that basement, time didn't exist, only the rhythm of the work, the scratch of the pen, the hiss of the drying lamp, the smell of vinegar and ozone. His eyes burned, his fingers cramped until they felt like lead. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He saw the faces of those children in every blank sheet of paper. By 5 a.m., the ink was dry. The children were reborn with new names, and by the time the Gestapo arrived at the orphanage, the birds had already flown. Survival was a game of nerves. Once Adolfo was traveling on a train, carrying a suitcase filled with the tools of his trade. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. German soldiers and French milice began a car-by-car search. Adolfo sat by the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched as they dragged people out. When the officer reached him, Adolfo didn't reach for a weapon. He looked the man in the eye and projected the ultimate image of boredom. He was just a young man with a suitcase. He offered a sandwich to the soldier. The officer glanced at the ordinary boy, dismissed him as unimportant, and moved on. Adolfo didn't breathe again until the train began to move. He realized then that his greatest protection wasn't his lab, but his invisibility. As the war neared its end, the demand grew. He wasn't just saving Jews, he was providing papers for parachutists, resistance fighters, and escaped POWs. He became a ghost within a ghost network. But the burden was taking its toll. He was barely 20 years old, yet he felt like an old man. He had seen too much darkness, felt too much responsibility. He had become a master of lies in order to protect the truth of human life. He lived in a world where a misplaced comma or a slightly blurred stamp was a death sentence, and yet he never took a single franc for his work. To sell a life was to him the ultimate sin. He was a volunteer in the service of humanity, armed only with a bottle of lactic acid and a steady hand. When the bells of Notre Dame rang out to celebrate the liberation of Paris in 1944, Adolfo Kaminsky didn't join the dancing crowds in the streets. He stayed in his laboratory. For him, the war against injustice didn't have a calendar. He was recruited by the French secret services to help identify collaborators and Nazis trying to flee. But he soon realized that the world remained a place of borders and persecution. The boy who had learned to erase the red J from French IDs now found himself looking at a globe still scarred by conflict. For the next 30 years, Adolfo Kaminsky became the world's most sought-after ghost. He worked for national liberation movements in Algeria, for anti-apartheid activists in South Africa and Latin America, and even during the Vietnam War. He remained a man of strict principles. He never accepted a single cent for his work. He lived a double life. As a professional photographer, specializing in the play of light and shadow, a fitting career for a man who spent his nights making people disappear from the sight of tyrants. He lived in a modest apartment, his kitchen often smelling of the same chemicals he had used in 1943. The secret was kept for nearly half a century. His own children didn't know that the quiet, gentle man who took beautiful photographs was the reason thousands of people across the globe were alive. It wasn't until his daughter, Sarah, noticed the strange tools and the unwavering precision of his hands that the story began to emerge. In 2009, she published his biography. The world finally looked into the eyes of the master forger. He was no longer a shadow, he was a legend. Adolfo Kaminsky passed away in early 2023 at the age of 97. He left behind a legacy not of gold or monuments, but of breath. Thousands of families exist today, generations of doctors, teachers, and dreamers, because an 18-year-old boy decided that he would rather go without sleep than let a single child be taken. He taught us that when the law is used to destroy, the most moral act is to break it. Armed only with a bottle of lactic acid and a steady hand, he proved that one ordinary person can indeed rewrite the script of history, one letter at a time.